Good morning, everyone. I'm Ramayad, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. From this IMF Atrium, I am delighted to host and moderate this important discussion on the 2025 Africa Economic Outlook. What are the growth perspectives in Africa this year? That is the central question. And I'm happy today to welcome Dr. Amadou Sy, who leads at the IMF, the team who authored this important report. Dr. Sy, welcome to the Atlantic Council and to your home, to the IMF, which graciously hosts us today. The publication of the IMF Economic Outlook is always something. Let's start with a number. In April, you downgraded growth to 3.8% for 2025. Now, it is 4.1%. You mention a remarkable resilience in your report from Africa. What changed to make the outlook more resilient than expected? And does what you name holding steady mean Sub-Saharan Africa has turned a corner?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. A few points. First, the impact that we had forecasted, the impact of the higher U.S. tariff trades and the possible tariff war that could have happened has been lower than expected. The tariffs were lower than announced in April. We didn't see
U.S. tariffs.
U.S. tariffs, yes. And we didn't see also a tariff war. We were very worried back then about the impact of those tariffs, mostly the indirect impact to Africa through a slower global growth. So as our colleague from the World Economic Outlook have also revised global growth upward, we also had to revise the growth for African region upward. The second point is that we have also seen African policymakers take very, very decisive policy measures. For example, in Ethiopia with the currency market, also in Nigeria, and that has helped. And finally, we've had a uneven a trajectory for commodity prices, but we can say that for some countries, gold exporters, for example, with the price of gold doubling since 2022, the price of coffee and cocoa also increasing very, very, very much. But we've seen a good performance from the likes of Ethiopia, for example, Burundi, who are gold and coffee exporters, for example.
Thank you for sharing a few examples. For our audience, and especially those who are not very familiar with Africa, could you tell us what is the top 3 of fastest growing countries in Africa according to your forecast, and what are their main strengths?
Yes. So on top of the list, although I would encourage all the countries, but on top of the list we have Rwanda, Ethiopia, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Uganda, which have, this is looking at the past 3 years and looking even at our forecast for next year. So one thing I mentioned a bit, reforms, but I think the key is to the ability to implement sustained reform, to really keep the course. And these countries have been able to do that year after year, and it's paying really well for them. Of course, as I said, for some of them, especially if you're an oil importer, Brent price was almost $100 in 2022. In these days, it's about $60. So if you're an oil importer, if you are a gold exporter, a coffee exporter, a cocoa exporter, this also helps. But these countries have not just been lucky. They've been implementing macro stabilization and really sustained policy reforms. I would add Guinea, which is also growing very fast, but from a low base, and because of this mining sector boom that they are experiencing. Yeah.
So there are numbers you outline very well in this report. there are also the cost of living for the people. Why the inflation is still so high 5 years after COVID?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. But first, just to put things in context, median inflation for the region is going down, and this is encouraging. Okay. But we still have 1/5 of the countries with inflation rates higher than 10%, which is an issue that needs to be addressed. So the rate at which prices are increasing has gone down, but prices are still elevated because of the successive shocks we had. Africa has experienced a lot of shocks, COVID, and then the food and fuel price inflation after the Russian war in Ukraine. So it's true, the cost of living is still high. Now,
and you mentioned, sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned in your report, inflation is projected to remain in double digits at least the end of 2025 in about 1/5 of the region, including Angola, and a country just mentioned as in the top 3, Ethiopia.
Yes, and Nigeria.
So you can perform well in terms of growth, and though have such a high rate of inflation.
Yes. So the issues are, it's a complex issue, and there are many drivers of inflation. But one, we could say that monetary policy has to play its role, and it can take time for monetary policy to play the role. Inflation can be sticky too. It can take time for inflation to go down. Then also, some countries have had issues with their exchange rate. So if you have a depreciation, then you can have higher inflation. Other countries are also experiencing fiscal issues where, if you are not able to basically stabilize your fiscal deficit, and if it's increasing too much, that can also bring to inflation. Then you can even have idiosyncratic shocks. If your agriculture sector, for example, is having a bad year, some prices can increase domestically. And subsidies also. In some countries, they have reduced subsidies, and as a result, some prices that were controlled have increased. So, but the issue is to really have an independence in the central bank and let them do their job, because it has a lot of gains for the whole economy if they're successful.
I see. Thank you. You dedicate an important part of the report to tax administration, how to collect better, the fiscal policies. You don't ignore that in Africa right now, and it's been the case for years lately, there are youth protests everywhere, from Morocco to, even if Morocco is not in your report, but from Morocco to Madagascar, and even in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Senegal, there are many countries where youth protests express a need of basic public services. And you spend a lot of time describing what African countries should do better in terms of tax collect. What about basic public services?
Yes.
Because sometimes you can have a very high rate of tax performance, but no public services available for the people, and then you have these protests, and then political unrest, like Madagascar.
Yes. Now, this is key. And it's a global issue. We've also seen protests in Nepal, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia. But it's a key issue. And in the case of Africa, but first of all, why are we focusing so much on the need to mobilize more domestic revenues? So the issue is our countries need to really build some buffers, right? And then with the shocks that they are experiencing, having bigger buffers will help them be more resilient. But the global environment is so uncertain. We see official development aid is going down. We see still the tariff, there's some uncertainty there and so on. So in the report, we give some recommendations based on our technical assistance on how to do it in practice, some granularity. But that presupposes that the policy makers communicate very well why they are doing it, what are the objectives. They engage as the stakeholders and have really a strategy to get buy-in, to have some agency from the country. And that's where they have to show the value for money. What is done with the tax money? We really recommend that communication, but also transparency, starting with public financial management. The parliament, for example, which votes the budget, right, should have a transparent budget, should also be have asked the tough questions and then engage the people to do it. Of course, you've been in public service, so you know this better than me. It's very challenging, but the importance is really to engage and keep the course, keep doing it.
And also, these policymakers you are mentioning, they need a space to develop their policies, and they may be constrained by the level of debt. And I would like, from inflation, tax to debt, to maybe talk about this challenge. The report states that over 1/3 of the region is at high risk or in debt distress. Is the IMF recommending debt restructuring as a way out still?
So I would separate the two types of countries. So first of all, debt restructuring is the decision of the country. So we have we are part, and we're helping this G20 common framework, which with the Paris Club and the G20 countries is set to really help facilitate debt restructuring, help speed up the process at which debt restructuring is done. So, and some African countries have opted to be part of it. Chad was one of the first. We also have right now Ethiopia, we have Zambia, and we have Ghana. We had Ghana that also just restructured its debt. So that's that. But for the other issue, it's important to have an anchor, to have an anchor in terms of debt to GDP, an anchor in terms of primary balance, and see how the trajectory, to stay the course, so the trajectory leads you to your anchor. And that's where the policy makers face a tough challenge again. And that's where, because what you need to do is you will need to raise your own revenues if you cannot get concessional financing and so on. And the other lever you have is to grow. And that's not easy to grow, but domestic revenue mobilization, growth policies that are conducive to growth, for example, engaging the private sector, are key. And then comes the debt management part, which can help you have a breather while you are in your trajectory.
Let's take a moment on the solutions the report outlines, and you just mentioned some of them here. The importance of domestic revenue mobilization. You cite successful reforms in Rwanda, again, Ghana and Togo. What are the key lessons from these countries, and how can others replicate their successes if it's possible?
Yes. So the first one, which we discussed a bit earlier, is to get this agency, this ownership so that you have a buy-in from all the stakeholders. It's very key. And then the other one is really, basically there are again two instruments. One is tax administration, the other one is tax policy. So in tax administration, it's not necessary, it's okay, we're not going to raise taxes, but whatever system we have, we're going to manage it much better to get more. For example, digitalization, right? Having e-filing, trying to formalize a bit the private sector so that using all these new technology to get more taxes. And then, of course, you have tax policy, and there it's about getting more, but you have to think about the sequencing. You have to think also about compensating the losers, especially the poorest losers. So social protection is important. But I can give you an example. I was discussing with the Minister of Finance of Angola, and she was telling me about a project where they're trying to have, through satellite imaging, a better picture of the properties, the real estate in the country. And then the next step was like, okay, now we know what exists, let's see how we can tax it. Property tax is very low in Africa, and this is one avenue. Of course, it's complicated, but it's possible.
And debt management reforms, like you say in your report, can also support innovative financing mechanisms like blended finance. Can you tell us more about what blended finance means and why the flows are so small when it comes to the African continent?
Yes, so blended finance is the idea to complement public money, aid money, money from philanthropists with private sector money, and to blend that in order to finance projects. So it's true. It's small. Some numbers I've seen recently, of course we have to check, but 6 billion, 15 billion, which is really small compared to the financing gap that is needed for Africa to meet the SDGs. We're almost in 2030.
And what would be the right number to meet these needs?
Yes, so for example, I've seen one study by our colleagues that says that $500 billion is needed for Africa to reach the SDGs. So it's really, we're talking about, as you said, it's very small. Blended finance is very small relative to the financing gap.
What other countries would perform well in blended finance?
So usually it's those that have done more macro adjustment, that are bigger, that are richer, that would perform better. Because again, I remember going to Sweden and talking to a pension fund manager, and she was telling me, well, we want deals that are simple, that are standardized, and that are safe. So the 3S, as she put it. But there's a perception of risk from outside Africa which is higher. Sometimes we feel that perception is higher than the reality, but there's a perception of risk. Then you have also the issue that the pipeline, you need good project preparation, you need some standardization. So there are some challenges that are similar to those that typical foreign direct investors are facing too. And this is complicated. And also, sometimes, for example, when it's come to climate change, most of the money is not going into climate adaptation, which is what Africa needs more. So, but we've seen some, I think the issue is scaling up. We've seen some interesting moves, especially like in solar energy and so on. We've seen also other types of innovation, like debt swap. Development swap, Côte d'Ivoire, for example, etc.
Gabon.
So the ideas are there, but the idea is to scale it up. So recommendations, people mention, oh, you need to standardize more, you need to prepare, have a better pipeline of better prepared projects and so on.
Better regulatory framework.
But what I would say is, maybe the importance of the local investors, because there is also money in the local pension fund system, for example, but it's mostly not, of course, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia are outliers and more sophisticated, but in many other countries, it's parked in real estate.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And
so
the diaspora bonds, for example, these kind of things.
Yeah, developing the domestic bond markets and so on. So yeah.
So we keep talking since the beginning of our very interesting conversation. We keep talking about what Africans should do to get better. What about the rest of the world? Because you cannot ignore that Africans have some blames regarding the rest of the world and the way the international financial architecture is built. So I would like just there's many topics we can talk about here, but let's start with rating agencies. You mentioned the ratings. How can we reduce the gap, the perception risk you were mentioning? How can we reduce the gap of misunderstanding? Because obviously there is a gap of misunderstanding between these rating agencies' work and Africans who think they are not fair. You mentioned the remarkable resilience. You mentioned higher number than expected in terms of growth, and still ratings are seen as hard for Africans.
Yes. So I think the key word is transparency. So just from my own experience, when I studied more than 20 years ago, when you would open the Bloomberg, there was only South Africa in the Bloomberg as that's the only country that issued Eurobond. And now we have Benin, we have Kenya issued just $1.5 billion earlier this month. Angola issued $1.75 billion. And I can tell you, here right now during the annual meetings, there are lots of investors that are here, asking the tough questions to the mission chiefs, asking the tough questions to the delegations. They also go to these countries and they form their own opinion. Of course, ratings are important. And for example, if you are again, to come to the pension fund, if you are managing the pension fund of the Ontario teachers, for example, or the CalPERS here, your investment committee will have to depend on ratings to decide where it will put your money, the funds. So ratings are very important, but I think transparency from African countries and this dialogue, this cooperation with all stakeholders should help. Everybody is more sophisticated about Africa. Africans are more sophisticated about their own country, and investors too. And we see very, very good debates going on. But it's true, rating agencies are part of the issue, not the problem. There is the creation of an African rating agencies. We'll see what it will give. But to me, if you look at the debt of African countries have been relying increasingly on their domestic market, more than any other region. So the domestic debt market is becoming very important, and I think local ratings of local currency instruments is very important, and there's room for local rating agencies in each country or regional ones.
It seems that African countries are more and more creative to find local and domestic solutions to all these challenges. So how does it make sense for you? How does it make sense? There's all this debate about, in the US, the foreign aid cuts. Because, as you said earlier, there is a new tariff policy in the United States under the Trump administration. The USAID has been shut down. All these are domestic, policies from the U.S. perspective, and it has been. A lot of people were worried about these these U.S. aid cuts, but you say in your report there has not been so much damage.
Yeah. So for some. So the issue is aid has been on a declining trend, bilateral aid. For example, in many countries, remittances from the diaspora is higher than the bilateral aid. Some countries get really huge remittances, like in Nigeria, Senegal, and so on, the Gambia. So I think the issue is that it will affect the most fragile ones. That we have to think about it, because if you take a country like Niger, if my memory is good, it's about 10% of GDP of aid, bilateral aid. So, and then also the aid was going into, as you mentioned earlier, into sectors like health, education, humanitarian assistance. So the issue is really how can we prioritize aid so that those that need it the most don't lose it, and that is a issue. It's a bit too early for to see the numbers, but I would like to raise another issue. Even if a country has, from its fiscal revenues, the sufficient funds to substitute aid, it's not clear that it can substitute the aid delivery. So I'm thinking, imagine a country where aid was given to internally displaced people far, far from the capital, and you used to have this aid delivery system externally supported that could do it very well. If suddenly it disappears, even if the money is there, can you substitute quickly and then deliver aid in these difficult conditions? And we have doubts about that.
Many observers said during this USAID controversy that these aid agencies, whether they are from the US, from Norway, from France, from everywhere, should be more watched about in terms of outcomes, you know. Is it something the IMF could do, for example?
So there's a whole literature about the effectiveness of aid. Is aid effective or not, and so on. But I think, for example, I know that in previous cases, especially during COVID or so on, we've partnered with some aid agencies to understand better what is happening in the countries, who's affected the most, and how to increase the efficiency of policies. So we've done that.
Because the US administration blamed the USAID for a lack of outcomes in terms of development, etc. So that's why I was wondering if there's something in the future that could be done with the remaining aid agencies.
Yeah, I should say that the IMF gives a lot of capacity development, a lot of technical assistance to those countries that need aid the most, the fragile countries. And most of the technical assistance that the fund gives goes to Africa.
So we covered rating agencies, foreign aids, in terms of, the external actors. In your report, you also mentioned that you have concerns about the region. Even if you are optimistic for 2025, you know, you have concern for the region over the next year, the coming year, because of these aid cuts, external shocks, domestic policy slippage, or anything else. Just tell us why you write that resilience cannot be taken for granted in Africa.
Yes, so the issue is that, as I said, our countries are very vulnerable to shocks, to global shocks, climate shocks, and at the same domestic shocks. So that's usually where we hammer down this message of basically having buffers. And so that you can be less vulnerable. So, of course, for the IMF, most of our work is in terms of making sure that your macro imbalances are addressed, and making sure that you are taking the right reforms and you are staying the course in terms of reforms. But that's the issue. Stay the course. Tough decisions have to be made, but African countries are vulnerable to shocks. But we've seen, if you look at the fastest countries in Africa, they are among the fastest countries in the world period. So we've seen really good progress, we have to stay the course.
Yeah. So there is a, thank you. We have to wrap up very soon, Matt. I have just a last question for you, because there is an actor we have not talked about. It's the IMF itself. The dialogue between Africa and the IMF has not always been easy. These past years, we heard about a lot of reforms, a better governance to increase African voices in the IMF, or more funding access. Where are we about the internal reforms to get more, to increase the Africa footprint in the IMF?
You know, I think it's a good question, and at the moment, one key issue is the quota increase. I think the 50% quota increase, and as we speak, delegations are discussing votes. 85%, countries with 85% of the votes you need 85% of the vote to pass this reform. Okay. So right now countries are discussing, and it's important because it will help, I think, us in terms of the resources we can devote to African countries. But I think the other side is usually we insist on the catalytic role of the IMF. We are not the institution that will bring the biggest check, but typically when the IMF comes in, others will follow. And that's where we have to work. And just in terms of dialogue, I think we've increased the outreach. I was mission chief for Angola a year ago, and we would go to universities, we would talk to think tanks, we would really talk to other bilateral partners, multilateral partners, and so on. And with this report, hopefully this is part of the outreach that the IMF is doing. And the press briefing was yesterday with lots of Q&A, and this is part of the ongoing dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Amadou Sy. It was a pleasure to have you. And I think the people who were watching have been able to know more about this report, this outlook for the coming year. And so see you next time to see how things.
If I can add, we have in French and in Portuguese also.
Okay.
So, a little bit of ads.
You will have an impact.
Thank you.
So for those who are watching, stay tuned, because today at 2 p.m. the next conversation will be about how Georgia's geo-economic realignment its economy and people. So see you there with the Atlantic Council.
Thank you.